This Juneau World Affairs Council presentation is a co-production with 360 North, recorded April 15, 2014 at 360 in Juneau. Scholar Alexander Dolitsky discusses Russian-Ukrainian relations, looking back and looking forward. Dolitsky is a native of Kiev in the former Soviet Ukraine. His academic background is in Russian history and anthropology, and he founded the Alaska-Siberia Research Center.
Thank you, Jeff, for your introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming here. I was a presenter at World Affairs Council in 1986, many years ago, for the first time, and I can see so many familiar faces who are loyal to this organization, World Affairs Council: Rory, Jane, and her husband, Michael. So thank you all for coming. This is a very emotional subject today. I was born in Kiev. I was raised in Ukraine. And as an archaeologist, I traveled in Transcarpathia 3 times. I excavate in archaeological sites. I traveled to Crimean Peninsula about 4 times and many different places in Ukraine, and in the capacity as an archaeologist or as a teacher. And once, when I worked in Transcarpathia area in the western part of Ukraine, I met a fellow who was a naturalist. His name was Peter Sova. He was an older fellow, probably 80 years old plus. And then I asked him, I said, Mr. Sova, Tavarish Sova, Comrade Sova, then, what is your nationality? And he said, I'm Transcarpathian. I said, well, there is no such a nationality. And he said, look, I was born when it was Austria. I grew up, it was Czechoslovakia, and now it's the Soviet Union. You tell me, what is my nationality? So that, and of course, when you look at the map, and I'm going to briefly talk about the history of Ukraine, you will see how complex the area is. If you think that Middle East is confusing, well, I'll introduce you to Ukraine. You will really know what confusion is. But also it's emotional, especially now. I did my own poll before I came here. I called my friends. Called my sister who lives in Philadelphia, spoke to her husband, asked him about Ukraine, Russia, and of course, suddenly, because they were born in Ukraine, they're kind of pro-Ukrainian. I called my classmate from Los Angeles, you know, he lives in Los Angeles now, and 2 months ago he was pro-Russia, now he's pro-Ukrainian. I called my classmate whom I know for many years in New York, the same thing. So anyway, my non-scientific poll was that probably 8 out of 10, at least those people whom I spoke to in the United States, they were emotional pro-Ukrainian. And I kept reminding them is that, you know, this is an emotional subject, but it's not a matter of pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. It's not a basketball game. You know, so we have to be very objective and to make sure that we are sort of calculating these things right. Because it might go out of proportion. Maybe it's already went out of proportion, especially in an area like this. So let me, with that, just what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a brief history of Ukraine, so you will see when the Ukraine really become independent as a state. And then I will talk about, very briefly about the Compatriot Program that started in Russia in 1999. And for 4 years I was a delegate of the Russian Federation for the Compatriot Program in the United States. I resigned in 2010. And then I'm going to play a footage, you know, just recent from news, of Vladimir Putin, his address to his cabinet. So it's not my saying, it's his saying about a week ago. So you will have an opportunity, and I'll translate. So you will have an opportunity just to see the tone, his temperament, his directives he gives to his government. So you will get pretty much a good idea where the country is heading, because if, you know, that basically he head of the state. So let's start with this, and first, just Russia and Ukraine, so you can see the proportions. The Russia is the largest territory or largest country in the world today, with probably about 15% of, of the territory in the world. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe, territory-wise, still, even without the Crimean Peninsula. It's about 600,000 kilometers square. To compare, it will be France is about 500,000 kilometers squares. Now, the Kievan Rus. In 1882, Kiev was conquered by the Varangians, noble Oleg, who started the long period of rule of the Rurik princes. During this time, several Slavic tribes were native to today's Ukraine. So you will notice is that those Slavic tribes, then they were not Ukrainians or Russians. They were Slavic tribes. And they probably spoke similar language. They have a similar material culture. And there were many different provinces that they had their own, the ruler or noble person who would be a ruler of this province. Kievan Rus, that's a text. During this time, several Slavic tribes were native to today's Ukraine as well, normally in the south. Christianization for formal government acceptance of Christianity in Kiev Rus occurred in 988. The major cause of Christianization of Kiev Rus was the Grand Duke Vladimir. Before that, these territories, they didn't have organized religion, just basically practiced paganism. Galicia-Volhynia. As a successor to the Kievan Rus on part of the territory of today's Ukraine was the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia. The state was ruled by the descendants of Yaroslav the Wise, Yaroslav Mudry, and Vladimir Monomach. For a brief period, the country was ruled by a Hungarian nobleman. 14th century. During the 14th century, Poland and Lithuania fought wars against the Mongol invaders, and because Kiev Rus was weakened by 250 years of Mongol domination, eventually most of today's Ukraine passed to the rule of Poland and Lithuania. More particularly, the lands of Volhynia in the north and northwest passed to the rule of Lithuanian rulers. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, well, formerly known as Rzecz Pospolita. After the Union of Lubin in 1569 and the formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the today's Ukraine territory fell under the Polish administration, becoming part of the crown of the Kingdom of Poland, the era, Kazakh era. The 1648 Ukrainian Kazakh rebellion of Khmelnytsky uprising, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, his name as a ruler, which started an era known as a ruin in Polish history as a deluge, undermined the foundations and stability of the Commonwealth. The Kazakh state, the Kazakh Hetmanate, usually viewed as a precursor of Ukraine, found itself in a free-sided military and diplomatic rivalry with the Ottoman Turks. I wonder if there is a text after that. Yeah. Who controlled the Tatars to the south, the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania, and the rising Russian Empire to the east. The Zaporozhian host, in order to leave the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, sought a treaty of protection with Russia in 1654. Well, the later that Kazakhs, they signed an agreement with Russia in 1667, and the Russian-Poland Treaty of Antrusova. Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary. After the partition of Poland, it was done 3 times, in 1772, 1793, and 1795, and basically Poland came to non-existence at that time. The extreme west of Ukraine fell under the control of Austrians, with the rest becoming a part of Ukraine, of Russian Empire. As a result of Russian-Turkish wars and Ottoman Empire, control receded from south-central Ukraine, while the rule of Hungary over the Transcarpathian region continued. the 18th century. You all can see map well, right? More or less. The Ukraine emerges as a concept of a nation, and Ukrainian as a nationality, with Ukrainian national revival in the early 19th century in the wake of the peasant revolt of 1768-69 and the eventual partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Galicia fell to the Austrian Empire and the rest of Ukraine to the Russian Empire. Most of Ukraine fell to the Russian Empire and the reign of Catherine the Great. I give a chance to read a little bit. In fact, during the Catherine the Great reign, that's where the Crimean Peninsula was invaded in 1780s. In fact, when I was in Crimea, there were places, you know, where they built the Catherine the Great beach. You know, so there is another places where she stayed and so on. So Crimean Peninsula was a part of Russian Empire since 1780s. And Crimean, the Russo-Turkish wars were fought the Crimean War of 1853, 1856 was in the Crimean Peninsula. So the Russians, they fought for that territory for, you know, in various wars with Turkey. First touch of independence. That's a good map. Ukrainian people first became independent with Ukrainian War of Independence of 1917-1921, but result in Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was quickly subsumed the Soviet Union. That when you look on the red line around, that basically 4 years of independence, but we have to keep in mind that was a time of intervention. It was a time of civil war. So the Wrangel, General Wrangel was supported by Britain. Yudenich was supported by Germans in the north. Kolchak was supported by US in the east side of Russia. So that when a Red Army, new Red Army in Russia kind of defeated one by one, you know, all these the generals, and the Wrangel was in the Crimean Peninsula, you know, then basically they took over Ukraine. Because of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the Russia didn't want, the Soviet government didn't want to participate in the World War I. So they give a large territory of Belarus and West Ukraine and a Baltic to Germany in order to have a peace. But then in 1939, as you know, when the World War II erupted on September 1, 1939, the Germany advanced to Poland, and of course the Russia, you know, advanced to the West Ukraine, and this yellow territory that in color basically was taken in 1939 within 2 weeks. And the later, you know, a little purple territory was given to Czechoslovakia at some point. Another territory was given to Romania, and the Crimean Peninsula in 1954. That territory was given as to Ukraine for administrative purposes. So Russians don't remember those history, how Ukraine was formed. But let's see if I have a text here so you can read it. First touch of independence, Carpathian. After Second World War, and we go to independence. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991-1992, Ukraine became an independent state, formalized with a referendum on December 1 of 1991. With the 2004 enlargement of the European Union, Ukraine now became an area of overlapping spheres of influence of European Union and the Russian Federation. Well, that's basically what we come to the contemporary time. My brief description of the history, you will find that Ukraine was divided and redivided between East European countries many times. And of course, they had this very strong desire for independence, especially in the western part of Ukraine. Let me just drink a glass of water for a minute. And truly, the state, or Ukrainians were independent as a state, is with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, 1992. So now I want to come to the more modern time. When Soviet Union was collapsed, it was very quick. It was unexpected. You know, when I left, you know, Soviet Union, I never expected that this country could possibly collapse. And it collapsed also to the surprise of many Ukrainians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, and so on. So when people went to bed on December 31st of 1991, and they were residents of one country, when they woke up in January 1st of 1992, they realized, you know, that now they are Uzbeks, or they're Ukrainians, or they're Russians, you know, that citizens of those countries. There is many things were sort of intertwined between republics. The way the Soviet economy worked, you know, was designed in a very ingenious way to some degree, is that one republic would produce a certain type of product, and another republic would do something else, and sometimes only part of it. So there were some sort of a dependency of one republic from another. You know, so what we see today, the production, what is, you know, that in the eastern part of Ukraine is quite essential, some of them, especially the defense production for Russia. It's engines for helicopters, it may be something to do with the missiles, and perhaps some other items that we do not know. So it becomes sensitive for Russia. They cannot very simply to, although there is a call for it, to de-importize, you know, that the Putin just give a directives to his cabinet to de-importize the production so they don't depend, especially military production, from Ukraine. But also I brought some documents. The Russian Federation government realizes that, well, wait a minute, there is a 35 million Russian-speaking people, former the citizens of the Soviet Union, that live outside of the country, so how we can relate to them. And they started the program under Yeltsin called Compatriot Program. So basically they said, well, it doesn't matter. That was, you know, their slogan or the message to us. It doesn't matter when you left, how you left, under what circumstances. You are brothers and sisters, and this is your historic homeland. When I managed and built a memorial in Fairbanks, World War II memorial, we invited the Rumsfeld, Minister of our State Secretary of Defense, and also the Russian Minister of Defense, Ivanov, along with other guests. Well, and then it was a very important event. And then the Russian embassy invited me to be in a coordinating council, meaning the delegate for the Compatriots program. I accepted that position, and well, I forgot to show this slide. Basically, this slide shows that Russia and Ukraine bilateral relations, the issues that they have, you know, and basically one of the issue that the Russia concern is expansion of NATO expectation. If Ukraine become a European Union state, you know, as you know, then eventually it become you know, a member of NATO. This is a 2010 when you look the numbers. Today, Russia last year was the 5th largest economy in the world, from 8 to 5. So their GNP in this chart is a little bit over $1 trillion, but as I know, the last year was close to $2 trillion. Now I kind of went ahead of time. Ukraine presidential election, that chart shows you 2010 when Yanukovych and Tymoshenko, they split the vote 48%, 45%, and Yushchenko got 6%. And what you see here in blue, basically it just goes along with the Russian speakers mostly in the east, and also Ternopil is a little bit, you see that the dot to the west, Crimean Peninsula, and a few places in the north. This ethno-linguistic of Ukraine group, that shows you basically where the languages are in Ukraine. Now, back to Compatriot Program. So, the Compatriot Program basically, this is a group in Washington, D.C. It's a U.S. delegation, you know, and of course, you know, they pay for our trips to Moscow, to St. Petersburg. And when I first went to St. Petersburg in 2006, I was astonished, you know, to see 1,200 delegates from nearly 100 countries, Russian former citizens or Soviet former citizens. And Putin was present for about 1.5 hours during this meeting. And of course was Lavrov, Russian Secretary of State, and his deputy. And the subsequent meetings were basically similar to that. In Moscow several times, at least where I participated, and once in Buenos Aires in Argentina. The agenda was to protect and preserve Russian heritage, protect the Russian language, but also protect the Russian citizens abroad. I don't know if it was sincere or it was a pretext for that, but that was one of the resolutions and one of the categories and agenda of the Compatriot Program. And I remember in 2009 clearly when Secretary Lavrov was there, and I was just as close to him as I am to you, the largest delegation would come from Ukraine, from Crimean Peninsula, from Kazakhstan, where is the Russian population. And that was 5 years ago. And practically they just encircled, you know, the Lavrov, and they demanded, you know, so that Russian schools would be open, that they complained that their newspapers, you know, they're closed, and their desire to be with Russia. That was a small group of people, of course, selected by the Russians, who came to Moscow. I felt the same sentiment, you know, that the delegation from Dniester River, close to Moldavia, also big contingent of Russian population there. They sort of had a similar desires. Compatriots, you know, here we in Washington, D.C., discussing, you know, certain issues, you know, promotion of Russian language. And some of the programs, of course, you know, quite humorous, I think. For example, now they, you know, circulate the petition to sign in the United States, at least, to sign petition for to recognize Day of Russian Heritage in the United States and send this petition to the Congress for approval. Oh, it's very timely, I tell you that. I know who is going to sign it, not me. And this is the forum in San Francisco where the Russian ambassador to the United States, Kislyak, I'm to the very right in this forum, basically speaks to the audience, you know, who gathered together, several hundred, the Russian speakers from around the United States, and basically he said we have to preserve Russian language here. You know, my Russian festivals that I organize 4 times in Alaska, they all were sponsored by the Russian embassy. And basically they paid $20,000, $15,000, and that's fine. And that's basically our Alaskan heritage, you know, no problem with that. But there were certain issues that I personally wasn't comfortable with. And here Kislyak, he made in this presentation in San Francisco, he made interesting point. He was emphasizes that the Russian trade, world trade, you know, is about $800 billion. And the trade between Russia and the United States is under $16 billion. Well, so the Russians, they really wanted to expand that so they have more trade. Well, when you have a trade, you have economic dependency to some degree. But that was, you know, his, not request, but his point he's trying to make. And of course, they were in Juneau during one of the festival, Consul General former, from Seattle, and Veronika Krasheninnikova, interesting figure. Now she is quite active in Moscow, and she is basically quite anti-American in terms of her views, where we should be, or Russia, in relations to the United States. It was quite surprising to me. But she was our guest during the festival. About 5 years ago, when I was in Russia, I sensed that anti-American sentiment in the last 5 years. And it's now just only on the rise. Their media is very intense, especially Channel 1 and Channel 24. It's like our CNN. Just always pointing to United States behind the European Union. United States send 150 or more special forces to eastern Ukraine. United States, of course, we know about our Navy near that large port, Odessa in the Black Sea, and so on. And just yesterday, just tell you how confusing it is. Why news reports one thing, and I'm watching in the last, I don't know, several days, Channel 1 and Channel 24, and it's just all about the same thing, about uprising in eastern part of Ukraine. And when you watch Ukrainian news, there is something else. Like this one was interesting with Jeff, we downloaded yesterday. And I just want to read what was in Russian, what it said. Suddenly those green people arrived, so that the citizens in Smolensk, a little town in eastern Ukraine, they couldn't figure out who are these people, because the green people, they called the green people the Russians, who send their special agents in kind of green outfit or uniform without any identification, so they know who they are. So in Russian, they would say, today in the morning in the city, the people appeared in camouflaged with automatic guns near that city hall. And journalists didn't want to ask him questions for some time or take a photographs, but then one asked if they can, and they gave him permission. And they said, yeah, you can photograph us, and also give him a commentary. One of the men asked, what is your purpose to be here? And he said and what is your nationality? He said, I'm Ukrainian. And what is your purpose? Our purpose to secure a bright future for your region. So this type of talk. But I still, when I look at this, I think, are they Russians or they're Ukrainians? Now, about the Compatriot Program, one can say, one of the directives or category in the Compatriot Program was protection of the Russian citizens who live outside of Russia. And it's not so much us, those, who came to the United States for whatever reason and live here. About 5 million Russian speakers came in the last 20 years. You remember, it was a massive immigration from former Soviet Union. It's mostly Kazakhstan, it's mostly Ukraine, Uzbekistan. There is a repatriation, the many former Soviet citizens, they come back, or they want to come back to Russia. Not in a great number, but apparently, last year 150,000 applicants expressed their interest, and as well as in Ukraine, now they want to do that. So their concern is there. And when I watched the Russian TV just recently, it's very emotional for those. And it's not only Putin, who give directives. It's also Zhirinovsky. I just happened to meet him. He is the head of the Liberal Democratic Party. Well, he is not quite normal, I'll tell you that. When I remember we were in a meeting, he suddenly started cursing, and he's a very temperamental person. Originally, he was born in Ukraine. He basically said, now just before Putin sent his letter, to 18 partners in Europe, the Zhirinovsky sent a letter to Poland, to Czech Republic, to Romania, Moldova, and Hungary, and said, well, because he is a leader of his party, in fact, he's a notorious opponent to Putin, and he said, well, the Ukraine should be partitioned. You should get these territories that you had before 1939. Remember in the map, these little pieces? Zyuganov, he is head of Communist Party, and of course, Zhirinovsky has 16% in Duma. Zyuganov has about 15% of his party. He was terribly emotional. They already accepted 5,000 new members of Communist Party from Crimean Peninsula. It was a very ceremonial day for them. But also, he was watching Zyuganov is like just going back to Soviet Union 1960s, 1970s, kind of Khrushchev-Brezhnev era. And he was said, we are, it's a strong language, you know, we are function very well in isolation. We will mobilize our country, and we are not going to allow our people, you know, if there will be bloodshed, you know, in eastern Ukraine, we are going to intervene. And basically, it's not only Putin is saying, because we point our fingers to Putin all the time. Putin does this and that. And it's not only him. You know, it's head of the Spravedlivaya Россия. I just listened to him yesterday. You know, he is the one who actually was sanctioned by United States and European Union to travel to our countries. And he said, I don't care, I'm going to Crimean Peninsula, you know, for vacation. But, you know, he is very strong, and his party has about 15% too. And just watching the TV, the Russian TV, their political scientists, they in one voice, you know, they're saying that we are going to intervene because it is in our national security. Now, go back to Ukraine, you know, situation in Ukraine is that they announced a draft several weeks ago and basically said those who are 25 years old to 40 years old for a step, you know, please report to certain places when do recruitment. So it's officers on reserve. My question is, if at this point you don't have trained officers, you already have a draft for officer in reserve, that's not a good situation. When the Crimean Peninsula was taken by Russians in a basis, they reported that in one of the Ukrainian bases, only 3 out of 40 MiGs were in a flying condition. So, you know, it's not mine to make a judgment or evaluate the situation, but it seems to be, at least on the surface, the Ukrainian army might be not that well equipped at this point. So it's also people's sentiment, you know, that Putin is a very popular leader at this point. Duma gave me almost unanimous rights, you know, to intervene and to act. We have to keep this. We have to keep this in mind. But also, when I met Putin and Lavrov, they do not appear like an evil individual. You know, it was quite impressive to see Putin for 1.5 hours. Lavrov, when he speaks about our Secretary of State, he speaks with a great respect. When he gave the interview, 1-hour interview, you know, and maybe that's a different subject, how they want to reformat, you know, their economy and their diplomacy, go toward East, you know, because Europe doesn't listen to them, you know, at least now. And at this point, I would like to do this. Instead of my saying, I would like to play Putin for 8 minutes, and I will translate, and then you will have questions, and I will try to answer, okay? Can we play it now?
Хотел бы с вопросом министру иностранных дел.
I would like to ask a question my Minister of Foreign Affairs. Tell me about the letter that I mailed to our partners in Europe.
Информация и письмо, которое было мной подготовлено после
that I prefer my letter.
О состоянии нашего сотрудничества
about our cooperation with European partners. Your request was fulfilled. About your letter that for the countries that receive our gas via Ukraine, they received your letter.
обращение серьезно, обещали
They took it seriously and they promised to respond accordingly.
конструктивно. Из Европы реакции пока, вот, как я сказал, такая предварительная, но уже прозвучала реакция из Вашингтона.
However, we received the response from the United States, from Washington,
Россия должна не политизировать газовый
that the Russia should not politicize this matter and blackmail.
ценообразования и назвала вот то, что сейчас мы изложили нашим европейским партнерам, газовым шантажом.
Well, they thought it's the gas blackmail,
Странно,
meaning
странно,
Washington.
во-первых, потому что нехорошо читать чужие письма.
Well, I'm
И
surprised it's not good to read somebody else's letters.
газа в Европе.
The letter I didn't send to them, I sent to our European partners.
Американские наши всех подслушивают, подглядывают.
Well, we
совсем
know
красиво.
that Americans, they
А
listen.
если говорить
others.
серьезно, то
And if serious,
хочу напомнить, видимо,
I would like to remind
о том, что
that
формула
the equation formula for gas delivery
цена на газ, высчитывается цена на газ,
and the price
зафиксирована в
was
официальном
in a contract,
контракте
official
между
contract
российским «Газпромом» и
with Russian
«Нафтогазом»
Gazprom
Украины
and
в
Russian and Ukraine
2009 году,
in 2009,
когда те
when-
люди, которые и сегодня находятся
when the
у власти,
government that is today in
являющиеся
power
правительством, отвечают за
also
энергетику,
was in power
и
then,
тогда были на тех же должностях и принимали
were in the
участие
same
в
position and
подписании
they
этого контракта. С тех пор
signed the contract.
никаких изменений
There were no changes in this contract
не
since
было.
then.
Да, мы действительно
Yes, we really,
по разным причинам предоставляли в разное
for
время
different
различные
reasons,
скидки.
give different discounts.
Как известно, в 2013
In 2013,
году в декабре предоставили и кредит в 3 миллиарда
we
долларов.
even offered them a credit for $3 billion.
Снизили еще раз
We
цену
lower
на
again
газ
the prices for gas
при договоренности о том, что будут погашены
with a
все
condition that they will
задолженности
pay their debts
прошлого 2013
of last year,
года и будут исправно
and they will
выплачиваться
pay,
текущие платежи.
their dues
Ни того,
accordingly.
ни другого не
We didn't
сделано.
get any response for one or another.
Более того,
More than
весь
that,
драматизм ситуации заключается в том,
the dramatic
что
situation of
в
this
первом
is
квартале этого года
that in the first,
действовали самые низкие цены.
we gave in the beginning of the
И
year,
даже
gave
по
the
этим
most
самым
lowest
низким
prices.
ценам украинские партнеры перестали платить.
And even with that low prices, the
7
Ukrainian partners
апреля
stopped paying.
текущего года был
the
очередной
last
срок
year.
выплат по газовому контракту за март текущего года.
Well, in April, they still
Из
didn't pay
500 с лишним,
for the March of last
540
year.
миллионов долларов не
About
было
$560 million,
заплачено
not a
ни
1 cent, not a 1
ни
ruble or
одного
dollar
рубля.
was paid.
Вообще ничего.
Nothing.
Ноль.
Zero.
Это абсолютно нетерпимая ситуация.
It is not acceptable situation.
И в соответствии с ранее достигнутой договоренностью, естественно, «Газпром» все эти скидки снял.
And of course, we took off all these discounts.
В чем заключается проблема на
What
ближайшее
is the
время?
problem for the near future?
Она заключается в том, что Россия не может нести в одностороннем порядке
Russia
такую
cannot
нагрузку.
afford,
Именно поэтому мы
this type of
обратились
support.
к нашим европейским
so our position and suggestion to our European friends and
с тем,
partners,
чтобы все вместе
so that we all together,
как можно быстрее
as soon as possible,
провести встречу
meet together
и определить
and
пути
to
помощи и
decide
поддержки
how we can
украинской
help
экономики.
Ukrainian
Если
economy.
действительно кто-то
If really
по-доброму
someone
относится к Украине,
has a
действительно
goodwill to
любит
Ukraine
украинский народ, он
and
должен
Ukrainian
внести
people,
свой вклад
then they have
в
to make their own
недопущение банкротства
contribution
украинской экономики.
to help Ukrainian
Пирожками на
people.
Майдане не обойдешься. Этого недостаточно
Пирожки in
для того,
Maidan is
чтобы
not enough.
удержать украинскую экономику от полного хаоса.
It is not enough
Наши американские
support
партнеры,
Ukrainian
которые вот так
economy.
негативно отреагировали на наше предложение, и это очень странно, что это происходит.
Well,
Как известно,
United States negatively responded to our
1
suggestion
миллиард долларов
and
в
offer
итоге
$1
в виде
billion
кредитов и помощи,
guarantee.
в виде гарантий. Что такое гарантия?
What is
Гарантии
guarantee
тем банкам, которые
to the bank?
готовы были бы
There is no such a bank
финансировать Украину. Но таких банков нет. Значит,
who will
это
take,
никакой
these
нет.
obligations.
Ситуация действительно очень странная.
This is a very strange situation.
И Это вызывает у нас законное
and we are troubled by that.
Еще раз хочу сказать, мы
Again,
не
I want to say,
намерены и не собираемся закрывать
we don't have plans to close that
но в
gas pipeline
соответствии с имеющимся контрактом,
and want to
подписанным
follow
и действующим с
current
2009 года, никто его не
from
отменял.
2009.
«Газпром»
Nobody
имеет право,
canceled
и
this
правительство
contract
Российской
yet.
Федерации предлагает
We offering
перейти на предоплату.
to use advance
Это
payment,
означает, что
Meaning
Украина будет получать в следующем месяце
that
только
Ukraine will receive so
такое
much
количество газа, за которое она заплатит.
as much as they
в
can
этом месяце.
pay in
Мы
advance.
имеем такое право по контракту. И я
We
прошу
have these
правительство
rights in our
Российской Федерации и
contract.
«Газпром» ознакомить наших
And I want our
партнеров в
ministry
Европе
to
с этими положениями контракта.
send the addendum and to point to
Кстати говоря,
this
в моем
part of the
письме
contract to our
есть
European
ссылка
partners.
на эти положения контракта. Просто взять выдержку из контракта и направить
Just
в
take
европейские
this
столицы как
quotation from a
приложение к
contract
моему
and
письму.
send it to our European
Тем более,
partners.
что сам контракт в ходе политической борьбы на Украине давно уже слит в интернет.
And this contract is in internet.
И я просил бы Министерство иностранных дел довести
And I would like my State
дополнительную
Department
информацию до наших партнеров
to convey this information
и
to our partners.
напомнить, что
And to remind them,
«Газпром» — это не просто российское
and to remind that
коммерческое
Gazprom
предприятие.
is
Это
not just
акционерное
a,
общество,
it's
где
a commercial
почти
company,
50% акций
where is more,
принадлежит частным
almost
компаниям и
50%
фирмам.
of the
в том числе
shareholders are
иностранным.
private.
И даже такая большая компания,
And
как
even
«Газпром»,
such a
не
big
может
company as
нести
the
всю нагрузку
Gazprom
по субсидированию.
Cannot afford to subsidize
Это
Ukraine.
невозможно.
It is not possible.
Это все должны понимать.
Everyone should understand that.
Россия действует очень аккуратно, очень взвешенно.
We are very
И с уважением
careful
ко всем нашим партнерам.
and
Мы, безусловно,
calculating
гарантируем в полном
with
объеме
all our
выполнение всех
proper, with
наших
all our
обязательств
partners.
перед нашими
And we fulfill
европейскими
all our
потребителями.
obligations.
Вопрос не в нас. Вопрос в
Question is not
обеспечении
us.
транзита через украинскую
Question
территорию.
is
Я
how
прошу Министерство
to
иностранных дел
transit
выполнить это
that
поручение как можно
deliver the gas to our European partners. Well, I try to do my best. I hope you understood the translation. So, but what it really clearly shows, the head of the state gives the directives to his cabinet. That's what the media will report, and basically that's where we are. It was just a week ago. There is many of those footages in the last week in relation to eastern Ukraine, how the Russians are going to respond. I would like to stop here. So I give you a brief history of Ukraine. I will talk about the Compatriots Program because now, the Russians are basically saying, well, we want to protect Russian population, 5 million of those in eastern Ukraine. So it connected one to another. And the tone and directives that the head of the state gives to his cabinet, that's where the country is going to go then. So please ask questions and then I will elaborate on that, if you have. Rory.
Thank you for your comments, Alexander. The question I have is that with this Compatriots program and this whole notion of protecting people where they exist, did those, like in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, maybe Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, wherever these Russian people meet, did those Russian people that are being protected travel from Russia to these places and then ask for protection? Or were they native people to the places where they are, eastern Ukraine, and then by some consequence of border drawing end up on the wrong side of a line and then ask for questions? I guess my question relates to did the Russians that are asking for protections move from Russia to their new place and then ask for protection? Or were they born in those places to start with and are asking for protection back the other way?
Well, the Soviet Union, of course, it was a multinational country. I was born in Soviet Union. I left Soviet Union. Then I went back to Russia with Chief of Staff Gary Paska in 1989, as you remember those days. Then Soviet Academy of Sciences invited me, and I went to Russia many times. The Soviet politics was as such, basically people who were born in a certain place, they would live in a certain place, but they wanted to move people around And especially when they had a draft in the army, they would send, for example, if they would recruit me to the army, I most likely would not serve in Kiev. I would go to Sakhalin Island and maybe stay there. So somehow with all these industrial plants and with all this, recruitment and draft, the nationalities kind of moved around and shifted. You find many Ukrainians in Magadan. And of course, imprisonment would be the same thing. So the many Russians were in the Gulag during the Stalin time, and they stayed there. So that was the situation. So it's not surprising, is that millions of Russians live in Kazakhstan. I heard when I was in St. Petersburg about terrible conditions the Russians, have in Kazakhstan. Kyrgyzstan, for example, is very pro-Soviet. And they voted against of when United Nations condemned. It's one of the countries. In the Eastern Ukraine, when I listen to East Ukrainians, their Russian is really with a strong Ukrainian accent. Many of them want to come back, and there is a repatriation program. The Russians want to kind of change their demographic situation. We expected demographic catastrophe in Russia. It didn't happen. Last year, was other way around, was increase of rate, birth. They're native to the area. My grandfather was born and raised in Kiev, and my father, and so on. So that's why my friends who speak Russian, basically in the United States, they're kind of pro-Ukrainian because they're connected more to their place. But they still are Russian national. I don't know if it's answer your question. It's kind of difficult to figure out. Of course, it's a Russian, but because they're native to Kazakhstan, some of them, and they're more citizens of Kazakhstan.
Thank you for your insights. I have two questions. One related to Eastern Ukraine and then one about the Ukrainian government. First of all, regarding Eastern Ukraine, what's the ethnic makeup of the far eastern provinces? I know Crimea was supposedly like 85% Russian, but the eastern areas of Ukraine are perhaps not. What is the makeup? And then also, what is your sense of the true feeling of those far eastern parts of Ukraine as to whether they would actually like to be part of Russia or autonomous or what? And I can ask my second question, I guess, later.
Yeah. Well, the Crimean Peninsula, Russians really feel it's Russian. And when Putin gave his talk after the Crimea was added to the Russian Federation, I guess, before the Duma, I was out of country, but I listened to his speech, and he said, that Crimea, it is not a sack of potatoes. And history will figure out why in the world Nikita Khrushchev gave the Crimea in 1954 to Ukraine. We are not going to, debate that is today. They're very strong about Crimea. There is a lot of sentiments there. There's a lot of Russian history. When I was on the Crimean Peninsula, I saw the Crimean Tatars, Shivut-Kala, Karabam, all these places, but also it's Russian. It's a Russian-speaking population. Crimean Tatars were removed from Crimea during the Stalin time, but in the last 20 years, many of them come back. But you have to keep in mind is that the Crimean Tatars between 1500 and 1700, they captured nearly 2 million of their neighbors and selling for slavery to Ottoman Empire. So there was not a friendly communication with Ukrainians and Crimeans as well. So Crimean Peninsula is gone. Russians will not give it back. They will fight for it. For them, it's a sentimental, tremendous thing. The eastern part of Ukraine, I think the Russians are petrified of the fact is that all these industrial complexes could possibly be in the hands at some point of European Union and NATO. That is motive. We have to look at the nations like we look at the people. And I always said that. We have to consider the behavioral psychology. The Russians do not take ultimatums very well. For them, sanctions, it is an ultimatum, form of ultimatum. And they say, we are not going to take ultimatum. This is not a nation that is submissive, not in their history. Also, there's a kind of a paranoia, as we all know, defensive because of the course of their history. That's why it concerns me. of all these, I would say, miscalculations that could be done even in our part when we are trying to expand too quickly. Remember several weeks ago that former Secretary of Defense, the Gates, in his interview to Charles Rose, he said, well, perhaps expansion of NATO toward eastward was too fast and too quick. Well, that is a point. The Russians probably would tolerate for the West and the East, to have Ukraine together. But when they think about that expansion of NATO, that is their main motive and concern, and that's how they act accordingly. And the second question?
Regarding the Ukrainian government, which appears to have been less than optimal for many years, the quality of the Ukrainian government, its governance has been less than optimal. And I guess my question to you is, do you see that improving? The 50%, the huge subsidies for gas, which obviously are a problem and can't possibly continue, and just their organization, their corruption, and so forth.
Well, the numbers will speak for itself. Ukrainian GDP doesn't grow in several years. When Soviet Union collapsed in 1992, Ukrainian population was 52 million. Today it's 44. So the rate of birth declined, the rate of death, raised, but also massive immigration, massive. They lost 8 million people in 20 years when it should be either even or up. Not only them, other republics too, the Baltic, Kazakh, because of the immigration. Well, what I just hear is that Yanukovych was a terrible crook. And that's what I hear from Ukrainians, that he was a Putin's agent. And that Tymoshenko was not capable. Yushchenko was before he doesn't want to run anymore and he was poisoned. I think it's near chaotic situation. And regarding that East Ukraine, I don't feel that diplomatic solution is already possible. I'm just worried about Ukrainian troops that may not be very well equipped move into this territory and to be entrapped by the Russians who are on the borders, as it happened with Georgia. It's also very possible. The Russians, they are talking about CIA and the agents, and Ukrainians do the same thing. It's a troubling situation, and if they will lose part of that eastern part of Ukraine, then the entire country could be just partitioned. Okay, next question.
So during the change of power that occurred in the Ukraine just prior to this crisis, and I was reading something that said that the Western Ukrainian factions had neo-fascists within their ranks. Could you comment on that? Is that true?
That's what the Russian news said. There's a Bandera. Bandera was during this period of time, 1917, 1921. The first touch of independence, what I showed in the slide. Basically, he was one of the West Ukraine Kazakh who kind of managed to gather the group of Kazakhs, and they were quite ruthless. But then the Vlasov army, during the invasion of Germany, they supported Germans, and I guess there were some incidents of appearance of neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. But that's according to the Russian news. According to Ukrainian news, well, the Maidan, that basically just one of the group, and they have nothing to do with neo-Nazism. It depends whom you ask and whom you listen at this point. Well, if there is no other questions, I just want to make a very important point. Again, if somebody will ask me, are you pro-Ukrainian or are you pro-Russian, then my answer will be, I'm for peace and I'm pro Wall Street. But, well, stock market. The situation here is such is that it's difficult to take a turn. It's no longer bilateral between Russia and Ukraine. Other countries are involved. And there is more negotiations and talk is done between United States and Russia and the European Union. We have to consider that, and hopefully that we as a people don't make incorrect calculation, and our State Department will not miscalculate either, because we can get into such a mess that will be very difficult to get out. Thank you. That's about right.
That was scholar Alexander Dolitsky speaking about Russian-Ukrainian relations in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation. It was produced in collaboration with 360 North and recorded April 15, 2014 at 360 in Juneau.